My daughter looked me in the eye at a table full of strangers and told me that marrying again at my age was an embarrassment to our family. And in that exact same breath, she promised to take my grandchildren away from me forever if I did not obey her. I sat there frozen, holding a fork I no longer had the strength to lift, and I remember thinking, this cannot be the same little girl I raised alone for 24 years. That single dinner became the moment everything I believed about loyalty, about fatherhood, and about love cracked wide open and forced me to finally ask myself a question I had been avoiding my whole life. Was I really protecting my daughter all these years, or had I simply been afraid to live for myself? My name is Michael Turner. I am 66 years old, and for 37 years I worked logistics for a shipping company in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job where you learn patience because trucks do not care about your feelings, and neither do deadlines. I am telling you this story exactly the way it happened, without softening the parts that still sting, because I think somebody out there needs to hear it. Somebody who has spent years putting everyone else first and quietly forgot that their own heart still had a right to want something. If that sounds like you, stay with me until the end, because where this story goes might surprise you more than it surprised me. Before I tell you what happened at that restaurant, you need to understand where I came from, because none of this makes sense without the woman who came before all of it. Her name was Diane, and she was my wife for 19 years. We built a small brick house on a quiet street in Westerville together, planted rose bushes along the back fence, and raised a daughter named Rachel, who had her mother's stubborn chin and her mother's habit of never backing down from an argument she believed she was right about. When Rachel was 14, Diane was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and within 8 months, the woman who had been the center of our small world was gone. I still remember the hospital family room the night she passed, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and Rachel curled into the corner of a stiff couch wearing a school sweatshirt she had slept in for 3 straight nights because she refused to go home and change. I sat down beside her and put my arm around her shoulders, and she pressed her face into my chest and whispered, "It is just us now, Dad." I promised her right then that I would never let her feel alone. And for over 2 decades, I kept that promise in every way I knew how. I want you to understand something about those years, because they matter to everything that comes later. Raising a teenage girl alone, on a shipping supervisor's salary, in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet, is not something you plan for. I learned to braid hair from a library book because Rachel's ponytails kept leaning sideways and she cried about it more than once. I packed her lunches every single morning, remembering that she despised mustard that particular year, though the following year she decided she loved it, and I had to relearn everything. I stood outside dressing room doors at the mall, holding jeans she rejected one after another, pretending the wait did not bother me, because showing frustration felt like betraying her. When she got her driver's license at 16, I did not sleep properly for 6 months, because every car door slamming outside jolted me upright in bed until I heard her key in the front lock. I worked early shifts so I could watch her volleyball games in the afternoon, and I worked late shifts when tuition bills piled up on the kitchen counter. I postponed vacations. I postponed fixing the leaky roof over the garage for 3 years longer than I should have. And somewhere in all of that quiet sacrifice, I postponed myself completely, telling myself over and over that there would be time to think about my own life once Rachel was settled. Once she graduated, once she got married, once the grandchildren came, there was always a reason to wait 1 more year. I do not regret a single sacrifice I made for my daughter, not for 1 second. But I did not realize until much later that waiting had quietly become the entire shape of my life. Then, 2 years before that dinner, everything shifted in the most unremarkable way possible. I was volunteering at a church book donation drive in our town, hauling cardboard boxes into the fellowship hall, when one of the boxes split open in my arms and dumped roughly 30 paperback mystery novels across the floor. A woman crouched down beside me to help gather them up, picked up a worn detective novel, looked at the cover, and said dryly, "Well, at least nobody got murdered in the parking lot." I laughed before I even meant to. Her name was Carol Bennett, 63 years old, a retired elementary school principal from the next town over, widowed 6 years earlier after her husband passed from a heart condition. She wore sensible walking shoes, drank her coffee black with no apology for it, and had this habit of answering every question with complete honesty, even when honesty made a room slightly uncomfortable, which I found strangely refreshing after years of carefully managed politeness. We started meeting for coffee after volunteer shifts, then Sunday dinners at a diner near her house, where she always ordered grilled chicken, and then stole half of my biscuits while insisting she did not actually want any. Eventually, we began walking the trail around a reservoir near my house every Saturday morning, and even though my left knee ached with arthritis, Carol never once rushed me. She just slowed her pace to match mine and kept talking as if we had all the time in the world, which for the first time in years felt true. Being around Carol did not feel like replacing Diane. It felt like remembering how to breathe without asking someone's permission first. 3 weeks before that fateful dinner with my daughter, I proposed to Carol in her kitchen while she stood at the sink, scraping burnt cheese off a casserole dish, wearing yellow rubber gloves and muttering about whoever invented baked ziti in the first place. I had originally planned something far more elegant, a nice restaurant, a reservation, maybe even flowers. But standing there watching her scrub that dish with such genuine irritation, I simply could not wait another day. "Carol," I said, "how would you feel about burning casseroles with me for the rest of our lives?" She turned around slowly, one rubber glove still dripping, and stared at me for a long moment before saying, "That might be the least romantic proposal in the entire state of Ohio." "Is that a no?" I asked. She peeled off one glove, walked over, and said softly, "No. It is a yes." For the first time in years, I woke up excited about the future instead of merely enduring it. That feeling lasted exactly 19 days until I sat down across from my daughter to share the news. Now let me take you back to that restaurant, because I need you to feel exactly what I felt in that moment. Rachel had chosen the place herself, an upscale little bistro downtown with small portions and servers who explained the butter like it was a science experiment. She told me we needed somewhere appropriate for a family announcement, and I assumed, foolishly, that she meant my announcement. I told her about Carol, about the proposal, about how happy I felt for the first time since her mother passed. Rachel set down her wine glass very deliberately, looked me directly in the eye, and said, "Remarrying at 66. Dad, that is embarrassing." Her husband, Kevin, suddenly became very interested in cutting his steak into smaller and smaller pieces, refusing to look up. Rachel leaned across the table and said the words that would haunt me for weeks afterward. "Marry her, and you lose me and the kids." For a moment I genuinely thought I had misheard her over the noise of the restaurant. But when I asked her to repeat herself, she did not soften a single word. She told me that people my age get taken advantage of, that Carol had never contributed to what Diane and I built together, and that bringing another woman into the house Diane helped create was, in her words, disrespectful to her mother's memory. I reminded her that Diane had been gone for 24 years. Rachel pulled her hand back from mine as though I had struck her and said, "So that makes her replaceable." "No," I told her, "it means I am still alive." The table went silent. A server placed a breadbasket down and left without a word, sensing something he did not want to be part of. Rachel folded her arms and delivered her ultimatum plainly. "If you go through with this wedding, we will not be there, and you will not see the grandchildren." That last part landed differently than everything else. Because those 2 children were not an abstract threat to me. Tyler was 9 years old and loved sitting beside me in the garage on Wednesday afternoons while I changed the oil in my truck, asking 100 questions about engines. Ava was 6 and firmly believed that every single meal, no matter what it was, improved with a generous amount of shredded cheese on top. I asked Rachel directly whether she was really willing to keep my own grandchildren from me because I wanted to remarry, and she told me, without blinking, that she was asking me to choose my family. I told her Carol would be my family too, and her face hardened into something I barely recognized. "Then I guess you have chosen," she said, and stood up from the table. I looked at Kevin for some kind of support, but he only offered a small, helpless shrug, the kind of look a man gives when he is watching a storm roll in and has no intention of standing in it. I paid my share of the check and walked out into the cold February air alone. I sat in my truck in that parking garage for nearly 20 minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing. My first instinct, The instinct that had guided every decision for 24 years was to call Rachel and apologize, to find some way to smooth things over even though I had done nothing wrong. That had always been my pattern with her. Whenever she got angry, I found a way to make peace, even when peace required me to give something up. I actually picked up my phone and started typing an apology, and that is when a message from her came through first. It read, "Marry her and do not expect us at the wedding or the kids. Choose carefully." I stared at those words for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, a memory surfaced from decades earlier, Rachel at 7 years old, throwing a tantrum in our kitchen because I would not let her skip school. Diane had waited until Rachel stormed upstairs before turning to me and saying quietly, "You know, you are allowed to let her be mad at you." At the time, I had laughed it off. Sitting alone in that parking garage nearly 30 years later, I finally understood exactly what she meant. I deleted my apology, set the phone face down on the passenger seat, and drove home without responding to my daughter for the first time in her entire life. I let her be angry, and it felt like tearing something open inside my own chest. I expected to wake up the next morning feeling resolved, feeling certain. Instead, I woke up drowning in guilt, not because I believed Rachel was right, but because she had somehow made me question a happiness I had been building toward for 2 full years. That is the strange thing about guilt. After enough decades of practice, it does not knock politely and wait for permission. It simply lets itself into the room and sits down beside you like it belongs there. Saturday mornings with Carol had become the best part of my entire week, and that particular Saturday, I almost called to cancel. I drove out to the reservoir anyway, and the moment Carol saw my face crossing the parking lot, she knew something was wrong before I said a single word. "You forgot the coffee," she said gently. "I forgot a lot more than that," I told her. We walked the bare February trail together while I told her everything. Rachel's words, the threat about the grandchildren, Kevin's helpless shrug, the text message waiting for me in the truck. Carol listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, she stopped walking, turned to face me directly, and said something I will never forget. She told me she loved me because I was a good man, and she did not want that goodness to become one more reason for me to suffer. She said that if choosing Rachel over her was what would let me sleep peacefully at night, then I should choose Rachel. That single sentence hurt far more than my daughter's ultimatum ever had, because Carol was offering to disappear quietly rather than cause me pain, and that kind of selflessness cuts deeper than any threat ever could. A few days later, something happened that changed the entire direction of this story. A woman named Linda Foster, who had been Diane's closest friend since college, showed up at my front door carrying a small blue storage box she said she had found while cleaning out her attic. Inside were old photographs, a couple of faded Christmas ornaments, one of Rachel's second-grade art projects, and several of Diane's handwritten recipe cards. Near the very bottom of the box sat a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Diane's unmistakable handwriting. Linda looked almost embarrassed as she explained that Diane had made her promise years earlier, only to give me that envelope under one specific condition, and beneath my name in Diane's own writing was a note that read, "Only if David ever believes loving again means betraying me." My hands were shaking as I opened it at my kitchen table. Inside was a single page. Diane had written that if I was reading those words, she suspected I was doing exactly what she had always feared I would do, feeling guilty simply for continuing to be alive. She told me I had given her a beautiful life and given our daughter a wonderful father, and that debt, as she put it, had been paid long ago. She asked me to promise her one thing, that I would not spend the rest of my years guarding her memory so tightly that there was no room left for my own happiness, and that if someone kind ever found me, I should not send her away because of guilt over the past. She had already had her turn at love, she wrote, and now it was mine. By the time I reached the final line, I could no longer see the page through my tears. I carried that letter out to the backyard afterward and sat on the old wooden bench near Diane's rose bushes, reading it again and again, finally understanding that for 24 years, I had convinced myself that staying alone somehow honored her memory, when really, all I had been honoring was my own fear of moving forward. In the days that followed, Rachel began calling me constantly, and at first I thought she might be softening. Instead, Every single conversation circled back to Carol in some way, questioning whether I had thought things through, mentioning that people our age talk, wondering out loud whether Carol might be after my house. One Wednesday afternoon, she showed up unannounced with homemade chicken soup, something she almost never bothered to cook, and while we ate at my kitchen table, she casually asked whether I had considered downsizing. "This house is huge," she said, glancing around the living room. I told her I had lived there for 29 years and managed just fine. She mentioned that a nice retirement community might make life easier, and the way she said it sounded rehearsed, as though she had practiced the sentence in the car on the drive over. When she left that afternoon, she forgot a folder on my kitchen counter, and as I picked it up to bring it out to her car, a glossy brochure slid loose and landed on the floor. It was for a senior living facility, advertised as luxury independent retirement housing. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, telling myself she probably meant well. But something about the timing did not sit right with me at all. Then came the phone call that changed how I understood everything. One Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was watching a basketball game, and it was Rachel. I answered, said hello, and told her I would call her back, but the line did not disconnect right away. I could still hear voices in the background, and Kevin's voice came through faintly saying, "If he marries her, everything changes." Rachel answered quietly, "I know, we have to protect what Mom built." Then Kevin said something that made my stomach tighten into a knot. "We are already running out of time." The call disconnected shortly after. I sat completely still on my couch for several minutes, turning that sentence over and over in my mind. We are already running out of time. Maybe he meant the wedding date. Maybe he meant something about my health. But for the first time, a colder possibility crept in. The idea that my daughter's fear was not really about losing her father to a stranger at all, but about losing control over something else entirely. And if that suspicion was true, then I had been fighting the wrong battle from the very beginning. I barely slept that week, cycling through explanations, trying to convince myself I was imagining things because I was hurt and exhausted. By Friday morning, I asked myself a simple question. What would Diane tell me to do if she were sitting across the breakfast table right now? The answer came immediately. She would tell me to stop guessing and go find out the truth for myself. So instead of driving straight home after a routine doctor's appointment, I turned onto Main Street and parked outside the law office of Gregory Simmons, an old friend who had handled Diane's will decades earlier and even coached Rachel's youth soccer team one season. When I walked in, he smiled and asked if I was finally making a will or if something had happened. And 20 minutes later, after I explained everything, he leaned back in his chair and asked me plainly what I actually wanted out of all this. I told him I wanted everyone protected. He told me that was different from wanting revenge, and I agreed completely. For the next hour, he laid out my options in plain, simple terms. My retirement accounts already listed Rachel as beneficiary and would stay that way. An education fund set up years earlier for Tyler and Ava would remain untouched. The only real question mark was the house, and Gregory suggested a straightforward solution. Carol would sign a prenuptial agreement giving her no claim to my retirement or investment accounts, but allowing her the right to continue living in the house for as long as she chose if I passed away first. She could not sell it and could not leave it to anyone else, and when she eventually moved out or passed away herself, ownership would transfer directly into a family trust for Rachel and the grandchildren. Nobody lost anything. Nobody got pushed aside. Everybody knew exactly where they stood. And Gregory told me plainly, if Rachel still is not satisfied after that, then this was never really about fairness in the first place. Before I left his office, Gregory hesitated and asked whether Rachel had ever spoken to me about financial power of attorney or offered to help manage my accounts. I told him never. He opened a folder on his desk, explaining he was only showing me because it directly concerned me, and slid a printed email across the table. The sender was Rachel, dated 3 weeks before that restaurant dinner, and the subject line asked about consultations involving aging parents who might soon need help making financial decisions. My stomach dropped as I read further. She had asked whether his office handled competency evaluations for adult children who wanted to arrange financial authority over a parent before or after the parent needed actual assistance. She had described me in the email as healthy, independent, and still driving, but had added one sentence that stopped me cold. I am concerned he may become vulnerable if someone new enters his life. I sat there in silence, realizing my daughter had been quietly investigating ways to gain control over my decisions before she had even learned Carol existed. Gregory told me gently that he understood parents planning ahead for aging children was normal. But trying to remove someone's independence before there was any actual sign they needed help was something else entirely. That evening I drove straight to Carol's house and told her everything Gregory had shown me. She listened without a flicker of anger, and instead of reacting the way I expected, she simply asked how I was holding up, which was the first time in weeks anyone had asked me that question directly. Later, sitting together on her back porch under a dim yellow light, I told her I wondered whether all of this was somehow my own fault, whether I had spent so many years putting Rachel first that she genuinely believed my remaining life still belonged to her. Carol thought about that for a moment, and then told me something I have carried with me ever since. That parents spend years teaching their children they are safe, but nobody ever teaches parents how to survive the moment their grown children become disappointed in them. She told me I was not really choosing between my daughter and her at all. I was choosing whether fear would be allowed to make one more decision for me. The following Monday, Gregory called to say the documents were ready, and I signed everything: the trust, the updated will, and the prenuptial agreement that Carol reviewed and accepted without asking to change a single word. A week after mailing out wedding invitations ourselves, one envelope came back in my own mailbox with "Return to sender" written across the front in thick red marker. I did not need to open it to know whose handwriting that was. Inside was the exact invitation I had sent Rachel, folded once, no note, no explanation, just silence. I stood in my driveway holding that folded piece of paper as the late afternoon sun dropped behind the trees. And for the first time I understood clearly that my daughter was not actually trying to stop a wedding at all. She was trying to make certain I never had a life beyond hers again. And for the first time in 24 years, I was not sure I could let her succeed. The morning of the wedding, I woke at exactly 4:47, staring at the red numbers on my alarm clock for nearly 10 minutes before accepting I was not falling back asleep. We had chosen a small event hall near the reservoir for a simple Saturday ceremony in late April. White folding chairs, modest flowers, dinner served in the same room afterward, because Carol had said she wanted a wedding where people could still hear each other talk. At our age, that felt like an entirely reasonable standard for happiness. I stood at my kitchen window drinking coffee as the sky slowly shifted from black to gray, watching Diane's rose bushes just beginning to leaf out along the back fence. My phone sat face down on the counter the entire morning. Rachel had not called. I told myself I was prepared for that silence. I was not. Carol called around 7 to check on me, and when I told her I had not slept, she asked if I was truly okay. And I told her honestly, no, but I am still coming. And that was all either of us needed to say. By 11 that morning, the event hall was filling far beyond what I had expected. I had guessed maybe 40 guests would show up, but nearly 90 people walked through those doors. Old co-workers from my shipping company arrived in jackets that no longer fit quite right after years of retirement. One of them, Frank Dawson, still carried his old work cap tucked proudly under his arm, and told me I cleaned up pretty good before admitting his dress shoes were technically orthopedic. Linda arrived with a bakery box and immediately took charge of the guest book without anyone asking her to. Women from Carol's literacy volunteer program brought homemade lemon bars, and several of her former colleagues argued cheerfully over whether the coffee creamer needed refrigeration. Standing in that warm, crowded room, I realized something I had never fully understood before. For most of my life, I had thought of family as one narrow branch running straight from Diane to Rachel to the grandchildren. But somewhere along the way I had quietly grown roots in other places too, and every single one of those roots had shown up for me that morning. Still, every time the entrance doors swung open, I looked up, hoping. At 12:15, Gregory found me near a side hallway and asked if I was ready. And I told him as ready as I would ever be while he straightened my crooked tie. I asked if there had been any word from Rachel, and he simply shook his head, offering no false comfort, which I genuinely appreciated. The ceremony was set to begin at 12:30, And at 12:23, the entrance doors opened one more time, and Rachel walked in with Kevin beside her, wearing a navy dress and clutching a white folder against her chest like a shield. For one foolish second, hope rose so fast inside me it almost hurt, until I saw the look on her face and understood immediately she had not come to celebrate anything. Carol was standing near the front of the room, talking quietly with Linda when she noticed Rachel at the exact same moment I did, and our eyes met across the crowd. She did not move toward me. She simply trusted me to handle my own daughter. Rachel crossed the room quickly and said we needed to talk right now, not after the ceremony, and Kevin, glancing at the crowd of guests, suggested we should probably do this somewhere private, which was honestly the first sensible thing he had said in weeks. I led them into a small conference room off the main hallway, Gregory following close behind, and when Carol started to hang back, Rachel pointed directly at her and said she needed to hear this too. So Carol stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Rachel placed her white folder on the table and told me she had an attorney review the situation. And when I asked what situation exactly, she said my marriage, as if it were some kind of legal emergency requiring intervention. She pushed a document toward me, and it was not a prenuptial agreement at all. It was something else entirely. A proposal demanding I delay the wedding for 90 full days, complete a formal competency evaluation, and grant her temporary legal authority to review my accounts, my property records, and my beneficiary designations. I read through the first page twice before looking up at Kevin and asking if he had written it. Our attorney did, he said quietly. I asked on what basis, and Rachel folded her arms and told me it was because I was making a major financial decision under emotional pressure. Carol went completely still beside me, and I felt something settle deep inside my chest rather than explode, and I asked calmly, "Emotional pressure from whom exactly?" Rachel glanced sideways at Carol and asked if she really had to say it out loud. And before I could respond, Carol spoke up herself, telling Rachel plainly that she had already signed a prenuptial agreement 2 weeks earlier. Rachel blinked in genuine shock, and Gregory stepped forward to explain that the agreement confirmed Carol had absolutely no claim to my retirement accounts, my investments, or any inherited family property whatsoever. Rachel stared at me and asked if I had really done all of this without telling her, and I reminded her firmly that she was my daughter, not my financial supervisor. Her face flushed red, and Kevin picked up the document Gregory had brought, scanning the first page while asking about the house specifically. I explained that if I passed away first, Carol would have the right to live in the house for as long as she wanted, but could never sell it or leave it to anyone outside our family. And once she eventually moved out or passed away, it would transfer directly into trust for Rachel and the grandchildren. For just a fraction of a second, I watched disappointment flash openly across Kevin's face before he could mask it, and Rachel saw it too. She turned toward him and asked why he had told her Carol could take everything, and he stammered that he had only said she might, and Carol, standing quietly beside me, said softly that what he had actually said was designed specifically to frighten her.